introduce yourself in the chat, that'd be amazing. We will share all the slides at the end of the session as well. And if you've got any questions at any stage in proceedings, just ask. Ideally, stick a hand up, a digital hand. I can't guarantee I'll see you if you physically wave, or you can ask a question in the chat and I will happily respond as we go through the session as well. But good morning, everybody. Lovely to meet you. My name's Dave. Most of the time, I work for the University of Bristol alongside Jennifer, but I also work for an accelerator program as well. And I'll say a little bit more about both of those in just a second. I was asked to come along today to talk about valuable ideas. So what makes an idea valuable compared to one that is kind of just interesting? How do we know when we found a business idea compared to just an interesting idea? And we're going to dig into some of those questions, and I'm going to share some tools and methods with you this morning. So by way of introduction in slightly more depth, my name's Dave Jarman. I'm an associate professor at the University of Bristol, specializing in innovation and entrepreneurship. My specialist areas are very early stage idea and venture development. So I'm not an expert in how you take it to kind of huge scale around the world, but I am very interested in why people start, what they start, what is likely to work, and how you make some of those early stage decisions about entrepreneurial activity. I also work as a freelancer. I have my own entrepreneurial business as well. So I work for an accelerator program that basically helps academics with research ideas here in the UK think about how they commercialize those ideas to a much bigger audience. I've also been the head of a university career service. I've also worked in research commercialization kind of more broadly. I've also been a part of a number of different academic networks. But basically, you can call me Dave, and you're welcome to ask me any question that you like. So what we're going to try and cover off in, I think it's about an hour and a half that we've got together today, is we're going to talk about the difference between ideas and business ideas, as we've suggested. We're going to introduce an idea that we call value propositions, which is basically a proposal that has value. It's as simple as that. But we're going to work out why it might have value and who might be listening. We're also going to talk a little bit about prototyping as well, if we have time to do so. I'm definitely open for some interactions, and you can put those in the chat. If you can access the sort of digitally raising a hand, then please do so. Equally, if you're struggling in any other way, turn your microphone on and just shout Dave, and I will try and respond to questions as we go through. We will give you all the slides after the session, and we talk about some tools in the session as well, and we'll pass those over to you as well. So let's dig in. The first bit is, well, how do you get a good idea in the first place? Like, where do ideas come from? Well, the scholarship suggests that actually it's not that we're kind of plucking ideas out of the air or that we're sort of just dreaming about them. Actually, it's more that we build new ideas out of existing ideas. So there's a writer called Steve Johnson who wrote a book called Where Do Good Ideas Come From? And he's got this analogy around the idea of a scrapyard, a junkyard of spare parts. And that as we go through life, the things we see, the things we hear, the things we read, the people we know contribute spare parts to our scrapyard. And that when we're coming up with an idea, what we're doing is we're going, oh, this bit and this bit, I wonder if they fit together in an interesting way. Or I wonder if I can use that to do this thing over here that it probably wasn't supposed to do, or not what it was designed to do. So we assemble ideas out of existing ideas. And what this means is the better scrapyard of stuff that you have access to, the better ideas you're likely to have. And that if you looked at all of the ideas that you've had over time, you could probably work out where they came from. Did somebody say something and it made you think something? Did you see something and thought, I need to do something about that? Did somebody tell you about something and you thought, oh, that and this thing over here that I already know about, or that thing that my other friend said last week? Oh, they fit together in an interesting way. And that's where new things come from. So it's not magic. It's actually, we've got to be kind of almost hunter-gatherers. We've got to go and find stuff and bring it together. Another way of looking at this is a model that they call effectual logic. And I'm not going to talk about it at a kind of huge length here, but if you're interested, there's quite a body of literature about it. And it was a researcher called Sarah Sarasvati, and she studied a group of very successful entrepreneurs. And what she found was that what a lot of them seemed to be doing was, rather than saying, how do I come up with a good idea? They were saying, well, who am I? What do I know how to do? What do I know about? And who do I know? And that by focusing on the very personal, it gave people a sense of where to get started from. So, okay, well, I come from this community. I know these people. I understand this subject. I know people who do this and this and this. And if I put all of that together, the kind of thing I should do is this, because I'm already halfway there. So rather than trying to do something that you don't necessarily know anything about, rather than trying to do something that you don't necessarily have the resources to do, actually, it's about, okay, what can I do? Now, one criticism of this theory is it kind of suggests that you already have to have a lot of resources to get going. And actually, that's not true. Sarasvati's theory suggests that you can always get started with what you have. So even if you want to start a business in the pharmacy sector and you don't know the first thing about pharmacy, do you know somebody in your network who maybe does? Do you know something that somebody working in pharmacy would benefit from knowing about? Actually, you're always capable of taking small steps in a positive direction towards the goal that you want to get to. So it's just an interesting focus to try and orient yourself to thinking about what you know how to do and what you've already got to hand and how you best use it. So ideas are created from you in your context. That's where it all begins. Okay. So what my first piece of advice is, go and build your scrapyard. Where are you finding out about the future? Are you reading good articles or blogs or books or news sources? Are you listening to interesting podcasts? Are you watching interesting videos on YouTube or wherever you get your information? Do you read the press for the industry area that you're thinking of going into? Because almost every industry has journals, has podcasts, has magazines, has news sources. Are you keeping and noting down your good ideas? Are you building your scrapyard? Are you collecting stuff together so that you can find it again next time you need it? Because the amount of times we do have a good idea and then we're like, oh, I had a great idea this morning and I have no idea what it is anymore. I can't remember. We need to note stuff down. But equally, how diverse are your sources? Are you reading, listening, watching the same stuff as everybody else? Or do you have access to maybe more interesting or more unexpected sources of information? Because often the most interesting ideas are not the most obvious ideas. They don't turn up in the place where everyone else is looking. They turn up in kind of surprising places. So you need to have a scrapyard and you need to have a system of finding ideas that allows you to have more surprises. Because if you're just doing what everyone else is doing, then you're going to come up with the same ideas. Garbage in equals garbage out. The same stuff in equals the same stuff out. But if you can feed yourself a more diverse diet, you will produce more interesting outcomes. So just think that through. So my first kind of challenge to you all is, how do you diversify your diet of information? How do you find the right stuff at the right time to fit surprising things together? And then that really raises an important question. I've got all this stuff in my scrapyard. I've got all these ideas starting to emerge. How do I know what's valuable? Like, what makes a good idea. So in this model here, and this is a new version of a historic model, but actually this comes from a report that was only published this year in the UK. And they identify 5 criteria that you might want to think about when you're trying to judge whether your idea is any good. So does it work? So this thing, do I know how to make it work? Does it actually do what I say it does? Does it do it any better than the things that already exist? And it might be that it's cheaper, it might be more reliable, it might be more accurate, it might be a higher quality. But as long as as long as it works and it does something better, then maybe you're onto something. The second one is anyone willing to actually pay for it? And this is really probably the most important challenge if you think it's going to be a business idea. Now, it might be that it's your customer who pays you for it. It might be that maybe a government or a community or a charity or another organization give you the money as a grant or as an award for you to do something for other people. That's fine too. But the money's got to come from somewhere. If nobody's prepared to pay you to do it, it's just not viable, and you should probably put it down. The third question, and this in a way is a way of answering the viable question, is it valuable? Does somebody value the fact that it exists? Is it worth it in some way? So hopefully, because it works, and it works for them and it achieves something in their life that they want to see done, that might be the reason that they want to pay for it. But it ought to help in some way. We ought to be able to say that this idea is not just possible and not just money making, but actually helpful. Now, I'm going to add another couple. Is it allowable? Now, what we mean by this, that if you're trying to do something in a given country, is that legal? Will people allow you to do it? So sometimes you try and do something in an organization and we say, oh, that's nice, but we don't do that around here. That's not how things work around here. Actually, it doesn't work with other systems that we already have. It's nice, but it doesn't work with the other things that we have. So it's not allowable. So sometimes we can say an idea is good, but it still doesn't necessarily work because the system doesn't allow for it to work. The final one here is it sustainable? So if we do this idea, will it lead to some unintended bad things? So yes, we can make money, but we're going to destroy the environment. Yes, we're going to make money, but some people are going to really suffer social consequences because of the things that we do. Actually, I think we're moving into a world, thankfully, where this stuff is not what we should be doing. That commercial purposes do not necessarily trump social and environmental purposes. So is your idea also sustainable? Because you wouldn't want to do something that led to bad outcomes necessarily. And it's worth thinking this. So history tells us that when people were inventing plastic, which we now regard as a massive problem, plastic was being invented because we needed something to solve the problems that we had then. So, one of the use cases for things like plastic was to stop the use of ivory. So actually, well, okay, if we, so in a way, plastic was a good thing. Super strong, lightweight material. That sounds like a good thing. Oh, it never breaks down and it poisons the environment. Okay, that's a problem. So when you're thinking about your idea, when you're evaluating your idea, these are some of the criteria that you might want to use. Now, one of the things we mentioned there was the idea of valuable and then also the idea of viable. Now, I dig into that a little bit. So how your audience for your idea perceives the value of your idea then sets up how viable the idea is. They've got to want it, and then they've got to be willing to pay for it. And that is the single biggest thing that kills startups. So the research basically says that over a 10-year period, 9 out of 10 businesses will fail. 9 out of 10 startups won't make it to 10 years. And the single biggest reason that most startups don't make it to a 10-year anniversary is that they didn't find their audience. And what this means is that they couldn't prove to the market, they couldn't prove that the market wanted their idea. They couldn't prove the market needed their idea, which basically sort of says, oh yeah, no, that's a clever thing, but I'm not going to buy it. Oh no, it's very nice, it's very pretty, but I'm not going to buy it. That is, and so that's really important. And what this also suggests, so if you look at this list of the reasons that startups fail, you'll realize that most of them are not about the idea itself. They are about the execution of the idea. So we couldn't prove that people wanted it, or enough people wanted it. We ran out of money before we could make it happen. We couldn't put the right team in place to make it to sufficient quality and standard. We got outcompeted by another organization, another product, another service. We couldn't get the price right versus the cost of making it. So we couldn't make any money. And it goes on. So actually, none of these are necessarily a critique of your idea, but they are things to think about when you're thinking, should I do this? And how should I do this? Can I prove that people actually want it and are prepared to pay me to do it? Because if you can't do those, it's not a business. It's just an expensive hobby, probably. So actually, before I go any further, any questions or queries about anything that I've said so far? All very polite and quiet. You don't necessarily need to be, because I'm here to be questioned. So however, what I would take away from this bit so far is think about diversifying the scrapyard of ideas that you've got access to so that you're more likely to come up with new and novel ways of doing things. But when you're evaluating those ideas, really think through, can I prove that people will want this? And can I prove that people will pay me to do this? Because that's rather important. Okay. So let me go on. Now, I've mentioned this idea of audiences.
Hi, David. I have a
Oh, hi, Sylvia. Yeah,
question.
go for it.
Okay, so in your, I think it's the sixth slide, right? You talked about how do you know if your idea is valuable, and you mentioned like 5 points.
Hmm.
So for us to be able to discover if our idea is valuable, must it fit into all these criteria? So maybe the idea is feasible, viable, valuable, sustainable, but it's not allowable in maybe a country. Doesn't it still make it a viable idea?
Potentially. What this does is a really good question. So effectively, if your idea satisfies some of these criteria, but not all of these criteria, should you do it? And the answer is maybe. So you raised the question there about, so it's feasible, it's viable, it's valuable, it's sustainable, but it's not allowable at the moment. What that might mean is, could you go and talk to the people who are saying whether it is allowable or not, and see if you can persuade them maybe to allow it? Or is there something about the idea that you could change just a little bit that would suddenly make it allowable? Is there something that you could do that would make it more likely to be allowable? So sometimes, let me give you an example. In the UK, if you are trying to sell services to the UK government, they will often say, because they are spending the taxpayers' money, because it's public money, they have to be very careful about who they buy things from. So they often say things like, well, we're not going to buy from startups who are less than a year old, because if we spend money on very new, very, at this point, unstable companies that don't have a long history, we might lose our money. So lots of government services like to buy things from organizations that have a longer history and are basically more stable. So one of the things that sometimes happens is we go, oh, we like the idea, it's feasible, it's viable, it's valuable, it's sustainable, but it's not allowable because our procurement rules say that we can't do it. So what a new startup might do is they might go, right, okay, so who do you buy things from? So government will have a supply chain. So could you go to another organization that already sell their services to government? And could you sell your services to that company to sell them on to government? And government will happily buy them from that company who are sourcing it from you, because that company's procurement rules might be different and they might say that this is allowable. And then suddenly it is allowable to government because you've gone through the right route. So does that make sense as an example? But all of those things are things that you can negotiate. So if somebody turns around and says, well, look, this just isn't valuable enough for me right now. And you might say, okay, so how could we make it more valuable? And usually they'll tell you, or they might say, oh, well, I'd like it to be in green, not yellow. I would like it to work faster, but I don't mind if it's less accurate. I want a different price. Okay. If that's possible, if that's something that you can do, then all these things become negotiable. So it's not that these criteria are kind of hard and fast. It's that they all become areas where you can innovate. Because if somebody says, well, look, that's all lovely, but it's just not very feasible, you can go, well, how do we make it more feasible? How do we make it more sustainable? How do we make it more valuable? So it becomes a good way of interrogating your idea.
Dave, I don't know. Can you hear me, please?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you for breaking it down. I think there is another question in the chat.
Ooh.
Someone is Temitope, she asked, how can I
Yeah.
find my target market actually need and are willing to pay for my products?
Okay. So we're going to get to that. So that's going to come into how we do some research. So we're going to get to that one. But yeah, absolutely good question. So let me step
Okay.
on. So that's where we're kind of going next. So one of the things that we need to do when we're thinking about how do we work out if this is valuable and viable is we need to work out who our audience is. Who's actually going to buy this stuff? Now, quick question to everyone here. I've got 4 words here: beneficiary, user, customer, stakeholder. Do they all mean the same thing, or do they mean different things? What do you think?
I think different things.
Yeah.
So was that Adiola?
Yes, please.
Hiya. Okay. So it depends on what?
Well, I think the beneficiary is the person who, as the word implies, who gains something from the product. So, for example, if I buy a toy for my child,
Mhm.
my child could be the user and as well as the beneficiary, while
Yep.
I'm the customer,
Yep.
but the company shareholders are the stakeholder, I think.
Okay, that's a great example. So, so thank you for that. So the way that I would define this, very similar to Adiola, the beneficiary is the person who benefits, and that they could benefit in lots of different ways. So to use Adiola's example here, the child might benefit because they have something to play with. The parent might benefit because now the child has something to play with. You feel good about that. They're busy doing something. That's great. The user is the person who uses the product or the service. So in this instance, I think we might argue that the child is probably the user of the item. But if we imagine a different type of example, so for example, a piece of software. So you work for an organization and they use a piece of software. You might be the end user of that piece of software. And maybe you work in a bank, you're using a piece of software for the benefit of your customers. So your customers benefit, you are the user, but somebody else has probably bought it. Now, in your example with the toy, it's the parent who buys it for somebody else. It's probably not the child. There are some situations in which somebody is all of the things. So, if I think about my phone, I was the person who bought it, I'm the person who uses it, and I'm the person who probably benefits from it. But we're going to show you some other examples in just a second. The thing I will also point out here is, for me, a stakeholder is anyone who has an interest in your product or service. So they could be a beneficiary, a user, a customer. They could be a shareholder in the company. They could be your competitors because they have an interest in what you do. But the important thing to notice here is that each one of these groups might need a slightly different reason to buy something. One person is looking for a benefit, one person is looking for the user experience, one person is looking for the price and the cost and the return on investment. Another person is just watching with interest. So they all need a slightly different argument to thinking about what they do next. So just to stress here, this is important because what you want people to do is you want people to adopt your ideas and you want them to use them to make a difference in their lives. So you have to persuade them to choose to use it, to choose to buy it, and you have to persuade them to use it in a way that will make a difference. So let me introduce you to the first of a couple of tools that we're going to share with you. So this is what we call the audience map, and it's developed in the accelerator that I work for. And this is something that we're going to give you a kind of a copy of, and you can use. But basically, it's a way of sort of identifying the different audiences that there might be for your product or service. So, who benefits, who uses, who buys, are there combinations of those things? And what it allows you to do is partly identify different groups of people who might want to do something. It asks you to think about the problem or the opportunity as they describe it, not as you describe it. How do they talk about it? Equally, there's an opportunity to think about, okay, so what is it that we are offering them? If we had to sort of describe what we're going to give them in a single sentence, how might we describe that offering to them? We might describe how we're going to go and engage with them. So are we going to set up conversation? We're going to work through somebody else? We're going to just email them, or we're going to send them a letter? Like how are we going to engage? And why might they not engage? Are they too busy? Are they difficult to reach? Are they too engaged in something else? Do they not have the money to do something? What might stop them? And this is really important because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to empathize with who they are and where they are. And we have to assume there might be good reasons why they might not want to do what we want them to do. And then we can identify a next step. So we know who they are. We know what we might offer them. We know how we might engage. We know what the barriers might be. What's our next step? And that's usually go and have a conversation. Go and do some research. So to kind of go back to the question about, proving my market actually want this thing, if we've said, right, here's the market, we think they're a beneficiary, we think they're going to pay for it, this is what we think the problem they have is, this is what we're going to offer them, this is how we might talk to them, this is why they might not want to talk to us, this is what we're going to do. So what is the research question? What is the research method that we might use to go and find out what they're willing or not to do? And yes, and thanks for all the stuff in the chat as well. I'm keeping it in the corner of my eye and I'm kind of thinking through the questions. But just this idea of separating things out is really important because often we tend to assume that all of our customers are the same, and it's just not true. So if I go back to that idea of a software item, say you're trying to sell a piece of software to a bank. Now, the beneficiary is the customer of the bank, and they might not have any idea that your software exists because they don't use it, but they may yet benefit from the bank using it. The bank staff are the users, but they probably weren't the person who bought it. So they're not really worried about the price, but they are going to be worried about whether the software is user-friendly. So they want a good user experience. Then you have the manager at the bank or the person procuring the software, and they are probably thinking mainly about price. They're trying to prove that by getting this new piece of software in, they can make savings or they can make gains in the business model of the bank. They all want a slightly different thing. And the person buying the software probably has to justify it to their boss, who's also got a different agenda. So we just have to think that we might need to frame our offer differently for different people. And that's where I want to focus in this next part of the session. So if I go on, now I'm going to do the next 2 or 3 slides relatively quickly, because in some ways they're quite common sense. But what I do on these slides is I mention some tools that you might want to go and look at in more depth yourselves in your own time. And I have, on the next couple of slides, provided some links to some useful websites where you can find out a bit more about the use of these tools. So this is how we go and do our research. This is how we go and talk to the people in our market. So we could observe them, like we could find a way to watch them do what they do and see how they do it. And that could be useful because often what people actually do and what they tell you they do are different things. So sometimes it's useful to both interview them and watch them and see if they do it any differently. So we could go and observe. We could survey them. We could interview or focus group and find out how they talk about the problem, what they've tried to do in the past, what they might look for in a solution. We could even show them what we think we've got and see how they react to it. We could do what we call autoethnography. And this is basically, we put ourselves in their shoes and we try and have their experience. So if it was a product, we might try using the product. If it was a service, we might try using the service and just see how we feel. We might just see what we do in that situation. And actually, this is basically what even the biggest of companies do when they do user research. So there's you might have heard of that. There's a very big scientific company called 3M, and they make Post-it notes, they make Scotch guards, they make, I think it's something like ridiculous, like 50,000 different products. But what they say they do in their customer research, they go and watch their customers using their products. They talk to their customers about how they use their products, and then they try to do it themselves. So what we just described. We might also think about building prototypes of things. So sometimes, as I've said, people tell you they do something, but actually they do something else. So could we build a prototype or a test or a simulation of something that allows us to discover what our customers really do? Because they might tell us they do something, but if we actually try to make them do it, we might find that they do something else entirely. Okay, so this is what we might look for. The models that you can see on the right-hand side, the empathy map and the journey map, I'm going to say a bit more in a second. So the empathy map is a tool that allows us to stand in somebody else's shoes. And you just use the canvas here to try and write down, to try and think about, for any given audience, and whether that's the stakeholder, the customer, the user, the beneficiary, what are they trying to do? What are their wants and needs and hopes in that situation? You know, what are their fears about that situation? If we were in their shoes, what might we hear them saying? What would they be hearing? What would they be seeing in that situation? And could they judge what success looks like? So let me give you an example of this. I don't know if anyone's ever seen or experienced what they call an MRI scanner. So it's a really big medical device. You see them in hospitals, and they're a way of scanning the body. Really kind of clever scanning systems. But they are basically a big tube in a huge machine that you stick a human inside. And if you've been in one, they're not actually very pleasant. They're quite noisy. They're a bit scary. You're stuck with the surface of the tube, like only about an inch or so from your nose. It's quite claustrophobic. You're kind of stuck in, you feel like a sardine in a tin. Well, the guy who invented this was really proud. They'd invented this incredible medical device. It was saving lives. It was making lots of people medically much better off. And he went to visit one of these in a hospital in America, and he was really looking forward to it. And in the corridor outside the room, he bumped into a doctor and a child, and the child was going to go into the MRI scanner to be scanned, and the child was really upset, and they were terrified of getting in this tube. It was dark, it was scary, it was claustrophobic, it was really noisy. They didn't want to do it. They knew that it would be good for them, but they were terrified of the experience. It was a big, cold, scary medical device. And the guy who'd invented it was kind of heartbroken. He was like, but it's so good. Why wouldn't you? But the child was terrified. The user experience, and he suddenly realized that empathizing with the child was terrified of this. So one of the things that they did was they built new fronts for the machines to make them look like a castle or a pirate ship or a playground. And they built Lego models. They built toys of the scanner so the kids could play with them on the ward before they went in it for real. And it just reduced the fear. It was about empathizing with the user so that they could go, oh, right, this isn't so bad. So this idea of being in the shoes of your customer to really understand what they're trying to get done. And there's a link on that page to think about it a little bit more. Now, the other tool I think is also a really useful one. It's called a journey map, and it's a way of thinking about what journey are our audiences on? What journey are our users on? So let me give you an example. So I work with some doctors in the UK who look at back pain. So at what point does somebody become aware that they have a problem? At what point do I go, oh, my back hurts? And then at what point do I choose to do something about it? Now, this might seem ridiculous, but apparently the average gap between somebody deciding that they have regular back pain and doing something about it is measured in years. People put up with it for years before they do something about it. So that's already quite a long journey. So at what point do you become aware you have a problem? At what point do you start to look for help? At what point do you find that help? And how did you find it? So, were you searching on the internet? Were you asking your friends? Were you looking in a book? Like, how did you search for what you were looking for? What happens in the initial meeting? What happens in any subsequent meetings? So one of the things that we talked about with these back pain doctors, I said, well, surely the first meeting between the patient and the doctor is really happy because they're going to get helped. And they said, no, no, it's not like that at all. Everybody thinks that if you have back pain, you go and see the doctor and the doctor will manipulate your back and suddenly you will feel better. And that's just not true. So actually that first meeting is always a little bit disheartening, a bit sad. So what we're doing here is we're just understanding the emotions and the thoughts of your audiences as they go through a journey. And that might be the journey that they currently experience. And we might compare that with the journey once they have your product, once they have your service. Will their life be much better once they've got what you're going to give them? But it's just a way of thinking through the journey that people are on, because it helps you work out what to do where. Actually, what is the thing that you need to be doing that makes your idea valuable and viable at each step of that journey? Now, I'm going to pause there again just to see if there are any questions or queries. Billy, that somewhat answers the question about proving maybe what the market needs. Go and watch, go and ask, go and look, gather the data, because if you're trying to get investment, you will need to persuade your investors that this is a real problem, that people really want to do something about it, that they're really willing to buy a solution.
Okay, a quick one.
Mhm.
I want to find out, is it better to do beta testing or market surveys instead at this point?
I would always actually do interviews first and then think about surveys, because what interviews give you is rich, detailed, nuanced data if you do them well. Surveys are often very superficial. Now, what surveys are good at is they get you bigger numbers. So the way that I would recommend is interview a few people, as many as you can in the time that you have available, and use those interviews to think about the questions that you would want to then survey with. Because usually when you've done one or two interviews, you'll find that they talk about things in a way that you hadn't quite anticipated, or they'll come up with ideas that you hadn't thought to mention, or they might frame things in a way that is, you suddenly go, oh, right, I need to use that as part of the survey. So I'm trying to think of an example. Oh, so something, I've got a student at the moment who is looking at providing meal services to elderly people in China. And her initial idea was that the elderly people would be able to use a smartphone to order meals. She went and did some interviews. And the thing that she realized very quickly was that those elderly people struggled to use a mobile phone, or they struggled to use smartphone apps on a mobile phone. They could do simple things, but they couldn't do complicated things. And actually, what we realized was that the elderly people were going to struggle with that method, but their children were actually there more often than we realized, and were worried about what their mum and dad, their elderly mum and dad, were eating. And they were willing to use an app to order food. So actually, she'd been talking about surveying old people. And we realized that just wasn't going to work. What we needed to do was survey their children about how they worried about what mum and dad were eating. So it really changed things. So a few interviews, maybe a bigger survey, because that might be that you can suddenly talk to dozens or hundreds or thousands of people and you might have bigger data. But there's always a point where you will never know the truth. You're doing an entrepreneurial venture. There's no such thing as a right answer. Doesn't exist. All you can do is de-risk. All you can do is reduce the chance that you're wrong. You will never be right, but you can reduce the chance that you're wrong. And the more data that you can gather, the more likely you are to reduce that risk that you're wrong. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on slightly, but as other questions come up, by all means ask, by all means put them in the chat. I will keep pausing at intervals. So one of the things that we're starting to point at here is that any idea that you want to bring forward, any product, any service, it fits in a system. There's lots of moving parts. You are trying to do something in somebody else's life. That's a big thing. You know, they were doing something before they got to you. They were doing something after they got to you. They were looking at something before they searched for you. They were looking for another thing after they searched for you. They might well use your software, but they're also worried about what they're doing at home. They might be using your product at home and worrying about what they're doing in work. It's complicated. And actually, I think we have to be, if we're going to empathize with our audiences, we have to have a sense of the system that they're in. So a couple of quick ways of thinking about this. One is that, could we draw a simple map? Could we identify different actors in the system? Could we identify the relationships that they have? Could we identify what they're trying to get done? Could we identify, well, that leads to that, leads to that, leads to that? And there's no right way to do this, but I tend to find that almost any picture helps. Somehow visualizing things just helps, because we often spot things that we hadn't thought of before. Another way of thinking about a system is to use what we call a problem structuring approach. So there's one listed here on the screen. So can you say what the problem is or the opportunity? Who has it? When is it? Where is it? And why is it? Because what's interesting is that problems are not problems for everybody all of the time in every context. So if we can be a bit more specific, it might be that actually we can focus and we can go, no, don't worry about that. That's what we do. It might be that we have to go, oh, maybe there's things that we can learn from when it's not a problem that will help us when it is a problem. The simplest and the most important thing here is it's about efficiency of your time and money. So if you were to think that this is a problem for everybody all of the time, that sort of suggests that when you do your marketing, when you do your sales, you are trying to sell to everybody, everywhere, all at once. And that is going to be expensive. Whereas if you can go, no, it's just this people, it's just these people, and it's mainly at this time, in this place, in this way, actually, we can be much more targeted with our advertising. We might focus on maybe particular keywords if they're doing an internet search. We might put our adverts physically in very specific places because those are the places where people have that problem. You know, we don't need to put one on a bus in every city in the country. We just put it in one place where they have that problem, and that's cheaper. So it's much more efficient. So that picturing the system can often be really helpful for working out how to do something with your idea. Now, the other part of this understanding the context of the thing is thinking about what might stop you doing it. So the image you can see on the right-hand side there is it's a model by a think tank in the UK who were doing loads of work with government services. And these government services were going through a design thinking process, and they were hoping that their bright ideas, their product or service innovations were going to scale. And what they often found was that no, they didn't. And they got bounced right back to the drawing board. And this is what they called the system immune response. It was just like, we want to do a thing, and the system says, no, you can't do the thing. And the reasons you can't are usually because we are measuring other things, competing incentives, regulatory frameworks, the law doesn't allow us to do it like that, procurement procedures, we've talked about those already, market readiness. Oh, no, we like it, but we're not ready for it. It could be that they fear a media backlash. It could be that culturally, that's just not what we do around here. So these are all kind of understandable, but frustrating. But if we understand the system, we can anticipate that. So if we go back to our example of British government not buying things from startup companies, okay, if we understand that system, we can work around it. Now that we know it's not allowable, we'll work around it. If we understand that that's not how they do things, okay, well, how do you do things? And how could we find a meeting point between how you do things and how we want you to do those things? It just makes things possible. So that idea of a system understanding helps us identify other audiences, other stakeholders that we could talk to. It helps us solve problems by going upstream or downstream of where the problem sits in time. You know, could we do something with the people who notice it earlier? Could we do something later in the process? And again, this is where a journey map helps us because we understand the journey. It also helps us avoid unintended consequences. It also helps us think, oh, if we do that, we can avoid unintended surprises later on. So another takeaway that I would like all of you to kind of go away and think about using, because I think it's really useful. Now, you may have heard the term a post-mortem, and this is what we do when we find a dead body. We conduct a post-mortem and we go, right, what killed? What was the cause of death of this deceased body? Could you do a pre-mortem? Could you, before you try and do it, just think about what might kill it? Could you get your cleverest and most critical friends around you and go, I'm thinking of doing this. Why might this not work? What might kill this idea off? Now that can be hard to take. It can sometimes make you a bit sad, possibly even angry to hear other people criticizing your idea, but it's useful because they're giving you feedback. They're telling you about things that might yet be a problem for your idea. And now that you have heard all of those problems, you can start to do something about them. And it's much cheaper and quicker to do it that way than to build the whole thing, go to launch, it doesn't work, and then all of your friends go, well, I would have told you so if you'd asked. Oh, it's obvious from the start that was never going to work. Go and ask first. It's quicker and cheaper, even if a little bit painful. So let's dig into the key method that I want you to be thinking about as you go forward. And again, we've got the tools to share this with you. So this is what we call value propositions. And it's built around a tool called the Value Proposition Canvas. And it was originally in a book called Value Proposition Design. The link's down there on the bottom right-hand side. And it basically frames two things to think about. On the right-hand side, you've got the stakeholder, the customer, the audience, the beneficiary. What are they trying to get done? And we call this jobs to be done. And then in the process of trying to get that thing done, what are the pains and gains that they experience along the way? So they're not the things they're trying to get done, they're the pains and gains. So, if I use a pen, the job to be done is I'm trying to write something down. But if my pen is a leaky pen or my pen doesn't work, that's frustrating and it's getting in the way of the job. If I was using a different pen, maybe I had a pencil, it kind of does the same job, but the context is different. Honey, I could rub this out if I wanted to. That might be good. So that's one side. What are people trying to get done? What's the context? On the other side, you've got what is the thing that you're trying to offer them? What's the product or the service that you're thinking of offering them? And then does that create gains in their life? And does it relieve pains in their life? And I'll give you a worked example in just a second. And you're trying to get these things to fit together. So if you've ever seen a Venn diagram, the sort of overlapping circles, that's what this should look like. If you've got a really good fit between what they want and what you offer, oh, amazing. That's just what I wanted. It does everything I need it to do. But if you're offering things that they don't want, and if they've got problems that you're not doing something about, well, it doesn't work. They're going to need to buy lots of different things to solve their problem. And they're going to look at your product and they're going to go, well, it's got all kinds of features that I don't want or need. And they expect me to pay for those things. I don't want to pay for things that I don't want. I don't want to pay for things that I don't need. So they won't buy it. But the closer you can get them, the more likely it is to work. So let me give you a worked example. Now, this is based on a social purpose organization started by the University of Bristol. And just by way of a warning, it tries to not solve, but help with the problem of domestic violence in the UK. So the researchers were interested in how do we prevent and reduce domestic violence. So it's quite a complex system, as will become clear, but hopefully it will explain not just the difference between beneficiaries, users, and customers that we've talked about, but it'll also show you how we might use the canvas. So for the victims of domestic violence, our first group, our beneficiaries, their job to be done is to stop or to mitigate domestic violence. Everything else is nice to have. That is the thing that they really want something done about. That's the job to be done. However, in their context, something that's difficult is that this is a stigmatizing and sometimes even a dangerous thing to talk about. So actually, as much as they want that job done, if that's going to cause risk for them, that might stop them doing that thing. However, we also know that if you can do something about it, the health and work benefits are amazing. They are not necessarily the point. They are not the thing that people are trying to get. They want to stop the violence. But if they can stop the violence, these health and work benefits emerge. So they are potential gains. However, these people are probably not paying for a service, because it's a difficult thing to buy a product or a service for. Now, one of the things that came back from the original academic research was that GPs, general practitioners, doctors in the UK often met the victims of domestic violence because they came in reporting other health problems. So people would turn up at the doctor with another health problem, and the doctor might be suspicious that domestic violence was taking place. Maybe they saw a bruise, maybe that there was just something that the patient said, just left the doctor feeling suspicious. So one of the ideas that came from the research was, well, could we train the doctors to spot the symptoms of domestic violence better, and then give good advice about what to do next, and refer potential victims of domestic violence to the kinds of social support services that would help them. So we've got a product in mind, and we know who benefits from it. Now, let's talk about the doctors. But they need a different value proposition. So for the doctors, their job is not stop or mitigate domestic violence. That's not a doctor's job. It's a nice thing if they can do it, but it's not their job. They're there to solve people's health problems. However, the doctors identified that actually being able to intervene in a meaningful way was something that they would like to be able to do. So we have a job to be done for the doctors in purple. However, one of the problems that the doctors have is they didn't really know what they were looking for, and they didn't really know what advice to give. So they wanted to do something, but it was painful to work out what to do. Doctors are also incredibly busy already, so they didn't have much time to do training, to do research on this. So they really needed quick help. However, the doctors were also quite motivated that if they could do something about this, it was also an opportunity to improve the health outcomes for the people visiting their doctor's surgery. So this was an opportunity for some gain. However, the doctors, being scientifically educated, wanted to make sure that whatever advice they were giving people was backed up by academic research. They didn't want to tell people stuff that wasn't well researched. So it had to be evidenced. So back to our product. If we're going to relieve the pain for the doctors, it's got to be underpinned by good research. It's got to be short and simple to deliver. Doctors are not going to turn up for 2 days of training. They want to turn up for like an hour. It does also, however, provide extra value from your visit to the GP. So this is something the GPs can talk about. They can say, yeah, we're also doing some good in this area too. However, we still haven't found anybody who's prepared to pay for this. The GPs were willing to be trained, but they weren't prepared to pay for it because that's not what a GP's budget is for. A GP's budget is for salaries and medicines. It's not for training on domestic abuse. So we still have a problem. And then we found another group of audience. And this was, in the UK, we have a system of local authorities, local government, and what we call clinical commissioning bodies who basically organise medical services in a geographic area. And these people have some money, and they are being measured by government on how well they spend their money on a variety of social issues. And they are always looking to save money so that they can better use the money on other things. And one of the things the research proved was that the downstream cost of not doing something about domestic violence was that you got bigger costs in healthcare, in the criminal justice system, in social services, in education, in housing. The research said that if you don't do anything about domestic violence, other things happen. People need independent, secure housing. Kids fall out of the education system and cost us money. People end up getting into trouble with the law because violence leads to other problems. But actually, if you do something about domestic violence upstream early, it reduces costs. So actually, local government can save money. So we found a customer, and they have a pain in that they want to reduce those costs, but this is a really difficult group to reach with conventional marketing. They could use the existing infrastructure. The doctors already exist. People are already visiting the doctors. We don't have to build any new things. We can reduce cost elsewhere in the system. We can relieve pain. And actually, it provides a good news story for local authorities and for doctors to talk about. They can say, you know, we're doing something in our communities about domestic violence. So I'm going to pause there for a second, because that is, I know, a slightly complicated model, but I wanted to show you something that had that complex model, that had different beneficiaries, users, and customers. And it also really illustrated this idea on the value proposition canvas of what is the job to be done, what's the most important thing for each group, and it's different. But that also the value of understanding the context that people are in. So I'm going to pause there for a second. Any questions or queries about what we've just talked about? What I'm going to do, if there's no questions here, I'm going to try and make sure there's some time at the end to talk. So I'm not going to talk about this in huge detail here, but all of these tools will be available to you because you'll all get access to the slides, and we will provide copies of this canvas. This slide that you can see right now is a variation of the value proposition canvas that we've developed for our audiences, and we think it's a better version, and it's available for you to use as well. On the right-hand side is where you describe the different audiences for the idea that you've got. You know, what job are they trying to get done? How are they evaluating success in that job? And in the process of doing it, what does the context look like? And then in terms of what you're offering them, what is it? How does it measure that it's valuable? What does it enable? What does it relieve? The slides that follow here are a breakdown of how to think about what you might put in those boxes. So the one that I would just draw your attention to here is when you're talking about what it is your audience are trying to get done, there are three ways that we sometimes talk about this. One is that they're trying to get a task done. They want to get from here to here. Sometimes people want to get what we call a social marking. And this is that they want to feel that they are part of society in a particular way. So they want to belong to a group. They want to feel like they deserve to be somewhere, or they want to acquire a social status of a particular kind. So sometimes it's not a task. It's more about acquiring a social status or a social belonging. And then finally, and there are some people who suggest that ultimately all jobs are actually about achieving an emotional state. Could you frame the job to be done as achieving a particular emotion? I want people to be happy. I want people to feel safe. I want them to feel secure. I want them to feel relief. I want them to feel superior. I want them to feel beautiful. I want them to feel knowledge, whatever it happens to be. Could you frame the job as an emotion? Because that's really powerful. The other side of the canvas is your chance to describe what you do. And again, I've offered some advice on the slide about how you might talk about what it is that you do for people. And the only piece of additional advice I'll give here is we buy things for different reasons. So the reason that you buy chocolate might be different to the reason that you buy medicine. Like, I've never bought medicine because it is in a beautiful packet. And I have never bought chocolate because it is described as 100% effective and fast acting. We buy things for different reasons. So just understand what it is your audience are trying to do. Some of the words that you might want to use are on this picture on the right-hand side. So this is the work of a company called Bain & Co. And basically what I like about it is it suggests that whenever you're trying to explain why your product or service is valuable, do it in the simplest words that you can. So does it save time? Does it simplify something? Does it reduce risk? Does it reduce their sense of anxiety? Does it give them a badge value? Just have a little think through what it is that would really resonate with your customers. And the more of these that you can hit, probably the more attractive it will be. But all of this stuff is to have a look through. Now, I just want to share a couple of other thoughts before we get to the very end of the session. Now, obviously, what I've just been suggesting is that you need to go and talk to your customers, your users, your beneficiaries, your audiences. And generally, that is always a really good thing, because the better that you understand them, the more likely they are to respond. So if you understand them, you will design better products and services. If you've designed better products and services, they are more likely to buy them and to use them and to pay for them. However, there is one risk. And the risk is that if we just ask our customers what they want, they tend to only tell us things that will make it a little bit better, because they tend to assume that the solution looks a bit like the other solutions that they've seen. They don't tend to think of the radical answers. They tend to think of the obvious answers. So we end up with what we call incremental innovations, little steps, rather than radical innovations, which are more valuable. To put this another way, Henry Ford, who founded the Ford Motor Company, famously said, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they'd have said they wanted a faster horse. And what he means here is that they didn't know that cars were a thing. That was not an answer that his customers would have told him. No one was going to say, oh, no, I want a car, because they didn't know what cars were. They just wanted a faster, more reliable horse. So sometimes you have to come up with more radical ideas. And that takes us back to kind of where we started from. So, if you're looking for a radical idea, if you're looking for something really different, you have to diversify your scrapyard. You have to see new things, you have to listen to new things, you have to read new things, and you have to expand your network to find those new things, because they won't be obvious. And again, that is all content that might feed into the product or the service that you might offer. But all of these tools are basically just a way to help you think about your idea. So one last thought on value propositions. If you've been able to fill in a value proposition, you might be able to come up with something like this, which is basically just a short way of articulating your idea. So our product or service helps a particular group of customers who want a particular job done. And we do this by reducing something they find painful and enabling something that they want to gain, unlike the competition. If you can articulate your idea quickly and neatly in a format like that, that is great, because then you can pitch it to people and you can see how they react. And then you're doing what we call testing. So you are starting to prototype your ideas on other people. So once you've discovered what they want, once you've discovered what the problem really looks like, you can start to go, well, here is my answer. And that could be as simple as saying it out loud to yourself, by yourself. I often say things out loud to myself to see if I can even say them aloud, because sometimes I can't explain them very well. And I have to try it a few times before I find a way to explain it that works. That is a form of prototyping. Sometimes I have to share it with other people And they might go, Dave, no. Or what? I don't understand. I don't get it. So you might want to test it on other people. You might want to build what we call experience prototypes. So what would the experience of using this be like, even if it doesn't quite work yet? You might build a functional prototype that actually works, but is still cheaper than the final thing. Now, some principles when you're thinking about testing that might be a little bit counterintuitive. You are looking to fail, but you are looking to fail fast, cheap, and forward. Now, if that sounds weird to try to fail, imagine for a second failing slowly, expensively, and in a way that you don't learn anything. And that feels like a massive waste of everybody's time. You don't want to make slow and expensive mistakes, but you're trying to do something new. So the chances are you are going to make mistakes. So how do you make those mistakes affordable? You do them fast, you do them cheap, you learn every time, and you move on. So fast failure is a really good thing. Right. Now, I'm going to give you a weird example that you've probably never seen or heard of, but I think it paints a picture. The thing that you can see on your screens dates from the year 1984 in the UK, and it is a personal electric vehicle called the Sinclair C5. They spent £8.5 million in 1984. We think that's about £30 million today. They spent £8.5 million developing this. The chassis was developed by a sports car company, Lotus. The engines were made by the electronics manufacturer Philips. They tested it in a wind tunnel at a university for its aerodynamics. They thought they were going to sell about 250,000 of these things. They sold about 2,500. It was a massive, catastrophic failure of a product. And just from looking at this picture, you can identify a lot of the reasons why it failed. They were trying to sell it to women who had started a family, but were going back to work after starting their family. And they were trying to commute into their jobs in London. Now, the first thing you might notice is that if these are working women who are probably still taking their kids to school and probably still doing the shopping, where does the shopping go? There's no space. Where do the kids go? There's no space. It also rains a lot in England. Would you want to drive one of these round in the rain in London in the winter? No, it would be horrible. Does it look safe on the road? I don't know. Would it look safe if you were surrounded by traffic, trucks, buses, cars? No, is the almost universal answer to this. So they could have prototyped this. Several people have suggested that actually, rather than losing £8.5 million on this, why didn't somebody just pedal a go-kart around London for a few days and see if people enjoyed the experience? Why spend so much money? Could they have made a fake image like this one? This isn't fake, this is genuine, but could they have made an image that looked like this to show people the product before they built it? Because I have shown this picture to 10-year-old children in the UK, and they have all identified why this product did not work. It's really obvious, but somehow this company made a massive mistake and lost £8.5 million. So how do we do it better? We build simple versions of things. So the image that you can see on the top right, the left hand, the black object, is what they call a Palm Pilot. It's an electronic device. The first version of the device is a block of wood with a piece of paper around it. And what that allows you to test is how big it is, how it feels. The paper, the guy drew basically all of the images of the software that would appear on the screen. But it's pen, it's paper, It's a block of wood. It's not injection molded plastics. It's not electronics. It's not software. They knew almost everything they needed to know about how the device would work before they ever spent any money on the electronics. The thing that you can see below it is an American business. They are an online shoe store. When they went to start this business, the logic was nobody buys shoes on the internet. If you want to buy shoes, you go to a shoe shop. You're not going to buy it off the internet. So when this guy went looking for money to start an online shoe store, nobody wanted to give him the money. So what he did, he built a very simple website. He took out some Facebook advertising, very cheap, and he went into his local town and he photographed all of the shoes in all of the local shoe shops. And then he put them as listings on his website. And then when people saw his advertising, some of them followed it to the website. Some of them bought a pair of shoes. And if they bought a pair of shoes from his website, he would run to the shop, he would buy the shoes himself, and then he would go and put them in the post. Now, that is no way to run a scalable business. But he had the data to prove to investors that advertising would bring people to a website, that people would buy things from that website and actually buy products and services. He had the data that would convince the investors that people were prepared to buy shoes online. And once he had that data, he got the money, he built a warehouse. It was a huge, huge and successful business. So what can you test quickly and cheaply about your idea before you spend too much money? Could you mock up the advertising? Could you get the front page of a website? Could you crowdfund? Are there ways of testing? And again, we've put some slides together here that you can look at in more depth that dig into some of that. But what I want to do, so actually one thing just to say about what the kind of things that you could test that people are interested. Test the process and the feasibility of making the thing and getting it in their hands. Can you test which features your thing should have? You might have 10 ideas. You might only be able to start with 2 or 3 of them. Which ones? Can you test the route to market? How do people want to buy it? How do they want to pay for it? So again, could be part of your pre-mortem. Now, I'm just going to round up with a bit of advice that pulls all of this together. So a recommended process. So we're going to use a model they called the lean startup. What could you build? The lowest cost prototype that you can build that allows you to learn something about what you should do. And then you measure it, you see how people react to it, you take their feedback on board and you learn and you go again. And you go through this iterative loop. And this was mentioned earlier about testing. Actually, when people just kind of are consistently telling you the same stuff again and again, you're probably okay. You've de-risked it. At some stage, you're going to move on and have to build something. You're just trying to reduce the sense of risk. And what this means is the entrepreneurial journey looks a bit like this squiggle. Sometimes you feel like you're going backwards when you feel like you should be going forwards. Sometimes you have days when everything works and it's like, whoa, amazing. And sometimes you have days when nothing works, everybody hates it, and it's all going wrong. Eventually, it starts to make more sense. The route becomes clearer. The way to do that is to design possible solutions and test them. And you'll learn from your tests and you'll redesign and improve and you test again. But that engine allows you to progress. So you need to design as if you have a vision of what the future could look like, but you have to test it as if you were probably hallucinating, as if you were probably wrong. Because if you're not doing that, you are probably mainly just fooling yourself and wasting your own time and money. So if you've got an idea, you need to test it robustly. Otherwise, you're wasting your time and you're wasting your money. Now, there's a couple of other ideas in here that you can look up and dig into if you want to. So this is a piece of my own research around, are you the right person to start that business? But it's more than we have time for today. So an action plan. This is what I would recommend that you take from this session. could you write down 3 things you need to go and do some more research on about your idea? Are there 3 people that you could talk to who might offer you some sort of shortcut or advice to developing your idea? Is there one thing that you can do today between finishing this call and going to sleep that would constitute some sort of concrete progress? Over the course of your program, I would be talking to at least 10 people about what you're doing, and I would test your big assumptions. I would conduct those pre-mortems. So we've talked about the difference between ideas and business ideas. We talked about value proposition. We talked a bit about prototyping. Thank you for your time. I know that you've been listening to me for about an hour and a quarter or so now. Any questions, happy to field. We've got 5 minutes or so left on the call. I'm happy to linger a little bit longer if it's helpful. My email address is there if anybody wants to come back to me with a question, but otherwise, I'm going to stop sharing. You should all get the slides after the call. Are there any other questions that we can answer whilst we're all here? Oh, I'm going to go to one question that I saw in the chat quite earlier. How can I prove a lot of people will buy my product without producing a lot of it? Well, I think identify who your audience is and test it on a few people. And, you know, if 7 out of 10 people in your target market like it and say that they would buy it, then you can suggest that on the premise that they are a sample of a much bigger audience, that much bigger audience will also buy it in those quantities. But I think you can always test. Oh, another question that was there about life coaching. How can I revive the program? Okay, there's 2 questions here. One is about reviving the program and one is about scaling. So in terms of reviving the program, going back to previous coaching clients and asking them what they liked about the program, but actually more than what they liked about the program, I would ask them why they wanted the program in the first place. Because that way you discover the kinds of people who are looking for life coaching. And once you've got a sense of who you're looking for, you could start trying some marketing attempts to reach more of those people. And you could also be thinking about how much time you have to support how many clients. And that if you were going to scale it to bigger audiences, how many life coaches you might need to train up to support a bigger audience. But you could be testing your messaging to that audience to see if it appeals to them. So, you know, different people buy into coaching for different reasons at different points in their careers. You could also try and test how you would train or support or evaluate a life coach who wanted to join your team. But you could talk to one other life coach you know about how that might work, and that might be an interesting test of the process. I think, and just the question about the slides, I've sent them to Jennifer already. Hopefully she will email them all onto you as well. Although I can't see her on the call at the moment, but she should, because we agreed to do that. So if you contact Jennifer, who's running this program, hopefully she will pass that on. Any other questions?
Thank you, Dave. In respect to the materials, when the recording of the meeting is being shared, the slide would also be shared to everyone.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia.
Thank you.
Yes. So Precious asked me about asking more questions. Yeah, if you've got them, honestly, just email. I am away for a couple of weeks later in August, but I'm around most of the summer here in the UK. So yeah, honestly, reach out and ask. Happy to help. And good luck with all of your projects. I saw a list of all of the things that you are thinking of doing, and they all sound really interesting. The trick is to go and discover what your audience think they want, but test that because they might want something different. And then also think about how you test your idea before you commit fully. because you just want to save time. So, an idea is a business idea if other people are willing to pay you to do it. If they're not willing to pay you to do it, it's an expensive hobby. That doesn't mean don't do it, but you have to just realize that nobody might pay you to do it. So if you really enjoy it, fine. But if you need them to pay you to do it, then you might have to change your plans. Any other questions or queries?
Hi, Dave. I have a question, not really a question, but just to clearly understand this. So you're saying if the idea is not sellable, then it's not an idea. It's not a business idea. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but don't forget, don't just, sometimes we go, do you want this? And they say no, and you go, over. Actually,
Okay.
sometimes it's looking, do you want this? And they might go, no. And you might go, what could we do that would make you want it? And they might go, oh, I want it in a different color, or I want it with 2 handles, not 1 handle. Oh, okay, right. Well, maybe we can do something. So it's always worth exploring what it is that people think they want and need. If you genuinely can't find people who are willing to do something in the way that you want to do it, I would stop. But it might be that you have to do what we call pivot, in that you think you're going to do one thing and it transpires that actually it's not that, it's just next door. And to be honest, I would say that happens to almost every business. We think we're going to do this and we end up doing that. We think we're going to do this and it transpires our customers want that. We have to decide if that's what we want to do.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
So I have a question to ask.
Go on, Mariama.
Okay, so I have a question to ask. If you have an idea, yes, people that in your community or in your country, people would love to, patronize or get involved. But then the idea is quite an expensive one, and the people that are willing to patronize don't have that money to, patronize that well. Or how can I put it? But then they are willing to patronize, yes, but then your idea is expensive. So even if they patronize, you won't make enough profit. So how do you go about, having that idea come to life? Or would you want to, if it were you, would you continue with it or not?
Okay, so you've got something that people say that they want, but they're not prepared to pay for it. So
Yes.
typically, the ways that you could still think about doing that is, could you find a way to do it cheaper and more affordably? And it might be that people still want it, but it could be done at a lower level of quality. And it could still be affordable for you to do, and it could be affordable for people to buy. So that's one way, is basically reduce your costs so that the price works and that you can still make some money. Another model would be is there a group of people who are willing to pay more to make something happen? So you could go towards the more premium end of the market, and you could serve the customers who do have the money, who want to do something. Another variation is what we call freemium, and it's basically, could you have 2 tiers of service? So there's a cheaper version that lots of people use, maybe even for free, or at a low price. And then there is a higher quality version that is more expensive, but the money that you make on this version allows you to fund that version. But because that version is cheap or free, people tell their friends about it, and it saves you money on the marketing. So sometimes a business will do one version, cheap or free, as a sort of marketing tool, and they'll do a more expensive version that is where they make their money. And by making their money here, it funds the other version.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
But go and test what people are prepared to pay for. So different versions of the service might be more or less attractive at different prices. So I would go and test people's willingness to pay for different things at different prices.
Oh, Peter. Thank you very much.
Okay, good question. We are slightly over time. So what I'm going to suggest, partly because Jennifer's not here, is I'm going to stop the recording. Well, I'm going to say thank you all for coming along. Lovely to see you. Lovely to meet you. And if you've got any questions, please just ask. I'm going to stop the recording.